My ex-husband cheated on me and left me with nothing. But he called yesterday, asking me to donate my kidney to save the woman he cheated on me with during our entire marriage. Brian left me 6 years ago for Stephanie, his 23-year-old assistant who he'd been sleeping with for 2 years of our 12-year marriage. I found out about the affair when she accidentally sent me a text meant for him from his phone while he was in the shower. Something about meeting at their usual hotel room at lunch. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. Just said he'd found his soulmate and our marriage had been dead for years anyway. News to me since I'd been planning our anniversary trip to Italy that same week. The divorce was brutal. Brian tried to claim half my teaching pension even though he made 3 times my salary as a pharmaceutical executive. Stephanie posted photos of them together while we were still legally married. She wore the jewelry he'd bought her with our joint account money. They got married 2 months after our divorce finalized in the same church where we'd said our vows. My own cousin went to their wedding, posted photos talking about true love finding a way. I blocked her and haven't spoken to her since. I rebuilt my life slowly. Went to therapy, took up pottery, started running half marathons, met a wonderful man named Robert who treats me like I actually matter. We bought a little house near the beach. Life was finally good again. Then Brian called last Tuesday. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe wanting to show I was over it all. His voice sounded different, desperate. "Can we meet?" he asked. "It's literally life or death. Please, just 1 hour." I agreed out of curiosity. We met at a diner downtown, neutral territory. Brian looked terrible. Lost weight, gray skin, hadn't shaved. He started talking before I even sat down. Stephanie's kidneys are failing. Genetic condition that just manifested. She needs a transplant or she'll die. We've tested everyone. Family, friends, even strangers through the registry. No matches. But then Brian remembered something from our marriage. My rare blood type. O negative with some unusual antigen combination that the Red Cross always got excited about. The same combination Stephanie apparently has. "You're her only hope," he said, grabbing my hands across the table. The doctors ran theoretical matches through the database. "You're perfect. Better than a sibling match. Please, I'm begging you. Save my wife." I pulled my hands away. "The wife you cheated on me with? That wife?" Brian had the audacity to look offended. "That was years ago. We've all moved on. This isn't about the past. This is about saving a life. A human being is dying. You could save her. How can you even hesitate?" I laughed. Actually laughed out loud in that diner. "You want me to undergo major surgery, give up an organ, risk complications, miss months of work, all to save the woman who destroyed my marriage? Are you completely insane?" He pulled out his phone showing me photos of Stephanie in the hospital. She looked awful, hooked to machines, yellow-tinted skin. "She's only 29, he said. "Her whole life ahead of her. You're 44, healthy, you can live with 1 kidney. Most people can. Please don't let her die because you're bitter about the past." Bitter? I stood up to leave, but Brian grabbed my wrist. His grip was too tight, desperate. "Sit down," he commanded. "You owe us this." "Excuse me? I owe you? For what exactly? For the affair? For the lies? For the humiliation? For taking half my savings in the divorce? What exactly do I owe you?" He let go but kept talking faster. "You could never give me children. Stephanie's pregnant. 8 weeks. If she dies, the baby dies. You'd be killing an innocent child. Could you live with that? 2 lives on your conscience because you can't forgive?" The pregnancy card. Of course. The thing he'd thrown in my face during the divorce. My infertility. The treatments that didn't work. The miscarriages he called my failure. Now suddenly an unborn baby was my responsibility? "You're a teacher. You're supposed to help people. You took an oath to do no harm." "That's doctors, you idiot," I said. "I teach 3rd grade. And even if I was a doctor, I wouldn't be obligated to donate organs to home wreckers." "Robert's waiting in the car," I said. "My husband. We're going to dinner after this." Brian's face went red. "You remarried? When? Why didn't I know?" I grabbed my purse and stood up without answering him. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys on the sticky diner floor. I walked out into the parking lot and spotted Robert's blue sedan exactly where I'd left him. Engine running, reading something on his phone. He looked up when I opened the door and his face changed immediately. He put his phone down and reached for my hand. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I shook my head because I couldn't form words yet. My throat felt tight and my eyes were burning. "I'm not even close to okay right now," I finally managed to say. Robert started driving toward our house without asking where to go. He just knew. The streetlights blurred past my window while I tried to figure out where to even start explaining. He waited patiently, 1 hand on the wheel and 1 hand holding mine. Finally, I just started talking. I told him everything Brian had said about Stephanie's kidneys failing, about the genetic condition that came out of nowhere, about how they'd tested everyone they could find. I explained the rare blood type thing, how Brian remembered from our marriage that I had this unusual combination that made me a perfect match. Better than a sibling match, the doctors apparently said. I told him about the pregnancy, 8 weeks along, and how Brian tried to make it my fault if anything happened to the baby. Robert listened to every word without interrupting once. He didn't tell me what to do or how to feel. He just drove and held my hand and let me get it all out. When I finally stopped talking, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said whatever I decided, he would support me completely. No judgment, no pressure, just total support for whatever choice I made. That's when I started crying for real, ugly crying with my face in my hands. Brian never gave me that kind of support in 12 years of marriage. He always had opinions about what I should do, how I should feel, what the right choice was. Robert just pulled into our driveway and held me while I sobbed against his shoulder. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay there staring at our bedroom ceiling while Robert snored softly beside me. The white paint had a small crack running from the corner that I'd never noticed before. My mind kept going in circles, coming back to the same things Brian had said. 2 lives on my conscience. That phrase kept repeating in my head like a broken record. A teacher who helps people. An innocent baby who never did anything wrong. Did I owe them this somehow? Was I being selfish by even hesitating? I rolled over and stared at the clock. 2 in the morning. 3 in the morning. 4 in the morning. Robert's breathing stayed steady and calm next to me. I watched the sky start getting lighter through our curtains. The next morning, I was a complete mess at the school. During reading circle time, I called on the same student twice in 5 minutes. Leanie raised her hand again, and I said, "Yes, Leanie. What did you think?" And she looked confused and said, "I just answered that question." The other kids giggled, and I felt my face get hot. After dismissal, when all the students left, my principal knocked on my classroom door. She came in and sat down at one of the tiny student desks, her knees practically up to her chest. "Is everything all right at home?" she asked gently. I started putting away books and tried to say yes, everything's fine. But then I just stopped and turned around and told her the whole bizarre situation. My ex-husband who cheated on me wants me to donate a kidney to save his pregnant wife who used to be his assistant. The woman he cheated with during our entire marriage. She sat there in that little desk and listened to the whole story. My principal was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said organ donation is a beautiful thing when people choose it freely. But nobody owes their body to anyone, regardless of history or circumstances. She reminded me about something I'd almost forgotten. During one of my miscarriages, the second one I think, I'd had complications. Serious complications that landed me in the hospital for 3 days. I'd nearly died from the bleeding. She'd sent flowers to my hospital room back then. "Major surgery isn't something to take lightly," she said. "You have to think about yourself first. Not about what makes you look good or what other people think you should do. What do you actually want?" I didn't have an answer for that yet. I called Mariana from my car in the school parking lot. She picked up on the second ring, and I started explaining about Brian showing up and asking about the kidney. She cut me off and said, "Come over right now." When I pulled up to her apartment 20 minutes later, she already had wine open on her coffee table and containers of Thai food spread out. Pad Thai, spring rolls, curry that smelled amazing. She hugged me hard at the door and said we're going to figure this out together. I sat on her couch and started eating because I'd barely touched food all day. She poured me a big glass of wine and settled in next to me. Mariana's first reaction was pure outrage on my behalf. She said, "Why does Brian think he can show up after 6 years and demand pieces of your body? Like you're some kind of spare parts warehouse he can shop at whenever he needs something?" Her face was red and she was talking with her hands the way she does when she's really mad. But then she got quieter and admitted something that surprised me. She said if it was her husband begging her to save her sister's life, she'd probably be desperate enough to ask anything too, even from someone who hated her. Desperation makes people do crazy things. She said she wasn't excusing what Brian did, not at all. But she could understand why a man watching his wife die might reach out to anyone who could help, even his ex-wife who had every reason to say no. That evening, while I was heating up leftovers at home, my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as a transplant coordinator from the hospital. She said Brian had listed me as a potential donor and she needed to talk with me about next steps. Her voice was professional and calm. She explained that they needed to start compatibility testing soon if I was seriously considering this. Stephanie's condition was declining and the pregnancy made everything more complicated. Time was a factor. Every week that passed meant more damage to Stephanie's kidneys and more risk to the baby. She asked if I'd be willing to come in for initial blood work and tissue typing. Just to see if I really was a match, she said. No commitment required yet, just information gathering. I heard myself agreeing to the appointment before I'd really thought it through. I told myself that getting information wasn't the same as committing to anything. I could always back out later. Robert drove me to the medical center 2 days later. He held my hand in the waiting room while I filled out forms. He held my hand while we walked back to the lab. He held my hand while the technician tied a rubber band around my arm and found a vein. She drew what felt like a dozen vials of blood, little tubes with different colored caps that she labeled carefully. Purple top, red top, blue top. Each one for different tests. My arm ached afterward, and I had a cotton ball taped over the needle mark. Robert bought me juice and cookies from the vending machine because I felt dizzy. The test results came back within 3 days. The transplant coordinator called me on my lunch break at the school. I stepped outside into the hallway to take the call. She sounded excited when she told me I was an exceptional match. Better than most sibling donors, she said. My specific antigen combination made rejection extremely unlikely. The numbers were almost perfect. She started talking about next steps and scheduling more detailed medical evaluations. Her enthusiasm made my stomach hurt. I thanked her and said I needed time to think. After I hung up, I sat on the floor in the hallway and put my head between my knees. Being a perfect match should have felt good, like I could actually help someone. Instead, it just made everything worse. Now the choice felt more real, more immediate, more impossible to escape. Brian's first text arrived the next morning while I was brushing my teeth. A photo of Stephanie in her hospital bed, tubes running from her arms, looking small and sick. The message said her numbers dropped overnight. I deleted it without responding, but my hands shook holding the phone. Another text came during my lunch break at the school. This time an ultrasound image, grainy and gray, with a tiny bean shape in the center. Our baby, the text said. Your biological match could save them both. I put my phone face down on my desk and tried to focus on grading spelling tests. The texts kept coming. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening. Updates on Stephanie's creatinine levels, photos of her sleeping, screenshots of medical charts I didn't understand. Sometimes just one-word messages. Please, think about it. Time is running out. I never responded, but I couldn't make myself block his number either. Something kept me reading each message, looking at each photo, feeling trapped between my anger at him and his obvious panic about losing her. Robert noticed me staring at my phone one evening while we were making dinner together. He put down the knife he was using to chop vegetables and turned to face me. What do you actually want to do? He asked. Not what you think you should do. Not what would make you look good to other people. What do you want? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The question felt too big, too complicated. I realized I didn't actually know what I wanted because I was still too angry to think straight about any of it. Was I saying no because it was the right choice for me? Or because I wanted to punish Brian for what he did? Was saying yes the compassionate thing? Or just me giving in to guilt and pressure? Robert waited patiently while I struggled to form words. I don't know yet, I finally admitted. I think I'm too mad to figure out what's right versus what's just me being vindictive. He nodded and went back to chopping carrots. That's fair, he said. Take your time. I called Fleur the next day during my planning period at the school. She was my therapist for 3 years after the divorce, the one who helped me work through all the betrayal and shame and anger until I felt stable again. I hadn't needed her in 2 years, thought I was past all that. Her receptionist put me on hold. Then Fleur's voice came on the line asking how I was doing. When I explained about Brian's request, about the kidney match, about feeling like I was drowning in this decision, she made space for me that same afternoon. Someone canceled, she said, but even if they hadn't, she would have fit me in. She recognized this could undo years of healing if I didn't process it carefully. Fleur's office looked exactly the same. Same gray couch, same box of tissues on the side table, same abstract painting on the wall that I used to stare at during hard sessions. She listened while I explained everything, taking notes occasionally, her face neutral and calm. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. Brian is using your infertility as a weapon, she said. He's framing this as you killing a baby, when really the question is whether you're obligated to undergo major surgery for someone who hurt you deeply. Those are two completely different things. I felt something shift in my chest hearing her say it out loud. She helped me separate Brian's manipulation tactics from the actual medical situation. The guilt he was loading onto me about the pregnancy, about being a teacher who helps people, about having a rare blood type. None of that changed the basic fact that my body belonged to me, and I got to decide what happened to it. During our next session, Fleur asked me a question that made everything suddenly clear. What would you tell one of your third graders if someone demanded they give up something precious because someone else needed it more? I pictured my classroom, my students with their gap-toothed smiles and scraped knees. I'd tell them their body belongs to them, I said slowly, that nobody else gets to decide what happens to it. Not their parents, not their friends, not anyone. Fleur nodded. So why doesn't that apply to you? The question sat heavy in the room. 3 days later, Brian was waiting by my car in the school parking lot when dismissal ended. I saw him from the building entrance and my whole body went tense. Several other teachers were walking to their cars nearby and they noticed my face, the way I stopped walking when I saw him. 2 of them stayed close, pretending to chat while clearly keeping an eye on the situation. Brian stepped forward when I approached. I'm sorry for ambushing you here, he started, but I'm running out of time and options. Stephanie's kidney function dropped another 15% this week. The doctors say she might not make it to her second trimester without dialysis, and that could harm the baby. His voice cracked on the last word. I need to know if you're going to help us. I pulled my keys from my purse and kept my voice steady. You need to leave school property immediately or I'm calling security. Brian looked shocked, like I'd slapped him. What? This is important. We need to talk about this. No, I said. We don't. You need to leave. Now. He stared at me and I saw the moment he realized I was serious. The old me would have accommodated him, would have stood there listening to his desperate pleas, would have put his needs before my own comfort and safety. But I wasn't that person anymore. When he didn't move, I pulled out my phone. The teachers who'd been watching started walking over. Brian finally turned and left, but not before saying Stephanie might die because you're too stubborn to forgive. I watched him drive away and my hands were shaking, but I felt something like power running through me. That evening, Mariana brought her sister Daniela to my house. Daniela worked as a nurse in a surgical unit and offered to explain exactly what kidney donation involved without sugarcoating anything. She sat at my kitchen table with Robert and me and laid out the facts. 6 weeks minimum recovery time, she said. Possible complications include infection, bleeding, blood clots, small but real chance your remaining kidney could fail someday, and then you'd need a transplant yourself. Permanent scar across your abdomen. Some donors deal with chronic pain for years afterward. She pulled up medical articles on her phone showing statistics and recovery timelines. Then she talked about money. Lost wages during recovery, she continued. If complications happen, insurance might not cover everything. You'd need follow-up care for years, regular testing to monitor your remaining kidney. Most donors don't regret it when they're helping family members they love, but you need to ask yourself if Stephanie qualifies as someone you'd willingly suffer for. The question hung in the air while Robert reached over and took my hand. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. A smooth male voice introduced himself as Gavin Crawford, Brian's attorney, and he wanted to discuss the donation situation in a more professional capacity. His tone was friendly at first, asking how I was doing and thanking me for taking his call. But then he shifted gears. He mentioned how unfortunate it would be if this matter became public knowledge. A successful elementary school teacher refusing to save a young mother and her unborn baby. The optics wouldn't look good for someone in my position working with children. He suggested we could avoid any potential scrutiny or media attention if I simply agreed to cooperate quietly. The transplant could happen discreetly, and everyone could move forward. He made it sound so reasonable, like he was doing me a favor by offering this quiet solution, but I heard the threat underneath every word. I told him I wasn't interested in continuing this conversation and hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I immediately called Robert at work, and he could hear the panic in my voice before I even explained what happened. He left his office right away and came home. We sat at the kitchen table and he made me repeat everything Gavin said word for word. Robert pulled out his laptop and started typing notes, creating a document with dates and times and exact quotes I could remember. He said we needed to document everything in case Brian escalated further. Then he called his own lawyer, someone he knew from his company's legal department, to understand what legal harassment looked like and how we could protect ourselves. His lawyer said what Gavin did was ethically questionable and we should keep records of all contact. That evening, I opened Facebook to distract myself and saw a message request from an account I didn't recognize. When I clicked it, my stomach dropped. It was my cousin, the one who went to Brian and Stephanie's wedding 6 years ago. She'd created a new account after I blocked her original one. The message said she heard about Stephanie's condition through mutual friends. She said I needed to do the right thing and stop being selfish. Family helps family, she wrote. I stared at those words. Family helps family. This from the woman who chose their side over mine, who posted wedding photos calling their affair true love, who never once reached out to see if I was okay during the divorce. I took a screenshot of the message like Robert taught me. Then I blocked the new account. But her words stuck in my head like thorns. Part of me wondered if she was right. If my anger was blinding me to a real life or death situation. If I was letting someone die because I couldn't forgive. The thoughts kept circling no matter how hard I tried to push them away. My next therapy session with Fleur couldn't come fast enough. When I told her about the guilt eating at me, she leaned forward in her chair. She said feeling guilty doesn't mean I'm actually guilty of anything. She explained how people use women's training to be helpful and self-sacrificing as a weapon, especially when children are involved. Brian knew exactly which buttons to push from 12 years of marriage. He knew about my infertility struggles, my teaching career, my desire to help people, and he was using all of it to manipulate me into giving up part of my body. Fleur asked if I would tell one of my students they had to give away something precious because someone else needed it more. I said no, never. She nodded and said that same rule applied to me. 3 days after that session, my phone rang again. This time it was a man who introduced himself as Benjamin Rogers, Stephanie's father. His voice was different from Brian's or his lawyer's. Quieter. Tired. He asked if I would be willing to meet with him, just to talk. He promised he wouldn't pressure me or make demands. He just wanted a chance to speak with me face to face. Something in his voice made me agree. We met at a coffee shop near my house. Benjamin was in his early 60s with gray hair and kind eyes. He thanked me for coming and bought my coffee. He told me about Stephanie growing up, how she loved animals and wanted to be a veterinarian as a kid, how she was excited about the pregnancy and had already picked out names. He talked about her dreams and her mistakes, and how scared he was of losing his daughter. He didn't excuse the affair. He said Stephanie made a terrible choice at 23 years old, and he wished she hadn't hurt me. But he asked if she should die for that mistake. If his grandchild should never be born because his daughter fell in love with the wrong man. His eyes filled with tears when he talked about planning her funeral instead of her baby shower. I listened and felt something shift inside me. Stephanie wasn't just the evil other woman anymore. She was someone's daughter. Someone who was barely an adult when she got involved with my husband. Someone who might actually die. After Benjamin left, I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for 20 minutes straight. Everything felt more complicated now. The clear lines between right and wrong had blurred into gray areas I didn't know how to navigate. That night, Robert found me at the kitchen table with my laptop, reading kidney donation stories at 2 a.m. Success stories and horror stories and everything in between. He gently closed the laptop and took my hands. He reminded me I don't have to save everyone. That compassion doesn't require me to sacrifice myself. That whatever I decided wouldn't make me a bad person. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The nightmares started that week. I dreamed about waking up on an operating table with a huge scar across my stomach, missing part of myself. I dreamed about complications that left me unable to teach or run or live the active life I'd rebuilt. I dreamed about Stephanie dying anyway despite the surgery. I dreamed about the baby growing up and finding me, asking why I let their mother die. I woke up gasping and sweating, and Robert held me until my breathing slowed. The nightmares made me realize how much fear was driving my inability to decide. I was scared of the surgery itself, scared of the recovery, scared of giving something precious to someone who hurt me, scared of living with regret either way. Mariana drove me to the transplant center 3 days later for the consultation I'd scheduled. The building was all glass and steel, modern and cold-looking. We sat in the waiting room with other people who looked scared or tired or both. A nurse called my name and led us to an exam room where the surgeon came in 15 minutes later. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with glasses and a calm way of talking that made everything sound routine. He shook my hand and Mariana's, then pulled up my test results on his computer. He walked through the procedure step by step, explaining how they'd remove my kidney through several small cuts instead of one big one. Recovery would take about 6 weeks minimum before I could return to work. There were risks like bleeding, infection, damage to other organs during surgery. Long-term, I'd need to avoid contact sports and certain medications. He stressed multiple times that this was completely voluntary, and I could change my mind at any point, even the morning of surgery if I showed up and decided I couldn't go through with it. His matter-of-fact tone somehow made it feel less overwhelming, like he was describing a routine dental procedure instead of removing part of my body. Then he mentioned something that made me sit up straighter. They'd found 3 other potential matches through the National Registry who were currently being evaluated. All 3 were going through the same testing process I'd completed. One was already scheduled for additional screening next week. This information hit me differently than I expected. I wasn't Stephanie's only hope. I was just her best match, her fastest option, the most convenient solution to her problem. That distinction felt huge suddenly. I'd been carrying this weight like I was the only thing standing between her and death, but that wasn't actually true. There were other possibilities. Brian had made it sound like I was her last chance, but really I was just the easiest path because of our history and his ability to guilt me. The surgeon asked if I had questions, and I found myself asking about those other donors, how long their evaluation might take. He said the process usually took 4 to 6 weeks from initial contact to surgery, assuming everything checked out medically and psychologically. So Stephanie had time. Not unlimited time, but time. Mariana squeezed my hand as we left the office. She could tell something had shifted in me during that appointment. My phone rang that night while Robert and I were making dinner. Brian's name on the screen made my stomach drop. I almost didn't answer, but Robert nodded at me, so I picked up. Brian was crying, actually sobbing into the phone. Stephanie had a medical emergency that afternoon. Her kidney function dropped suddenly and they thought they were losing her. The doctors stabilized her but said she was running out of time. He begged me to please just say yes, to stop torturing them with this waiting, to show mercy even if I couldn't forgive. His voice broke on the word mercy. I could hear machines beeping in the background, hospital sounds that brought back memories of my own time in hospitals during the miscarriages. Part of me wanted to give in right then just to make his pain stop. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger through therapy and time, recognized this as manipulation. The emergency might be real, but the pressure was calculated. I took a deep breath and told Brian I needed him to stop contacting me for 1 full week while I made my decision. He started arguing immediately, saying they didn't have a week, that every day mattered. I interrupted him, my voice steadier than I felt. If he reached out even once during that week, through any method, my answer would automatically be no. I would block his number and refuse all contact. The choice was his. Then I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but I felt something like power running through me. I'd set a boundary and enforced it. The silence from Brian over the next week felt strange, relieving but also anxiety-inducing in a way I hadn't expected. Without his constant pressure and updates and photos, I could finally hear my own thoughts about what I actually wanted versus what everyone else expected from me. The quiet created space for me to think clearly for the first time since that diner meeting. I found myself less focused on Stephanie and more focused on what this choice meant for my own life and future. Robert noticed the change in me, how I seemed calmer even though I still hadn't decided anything. I scheduled an emergency session with Fleur midweek because I needed help sorting through everything. She had me do an exercise that was harder than I expected. She asked me to imagine 2 scenarios. In the first, I donated the kidney. Was I doing it from genuine compassion for another human being in crisis, or from fear of being seen as vindictive and cruel? In the second, I refused to donate. Was I protecting my boundaries and bodily autonomy, or was I punishing Stephanie for Brian's choices during our marriage? The questions made me uncomfortable because the answers weren't clear. I wanted to believe I'd donate from pure compassion if I chose that path, but honestly, some of it would be about not wanting to be the villain in other people's stories. And I wanted to believe refusing was about boundaries, but some of it was definitely about anger at both of them for what they'd put me through. Fleur said that was okay, that motivations were usually mixed and complicated. What mattered was being honest with myself about all the factors driving my choice. During that same session, something else became clear. I was angry at myself. Angry for even considering this request, for letting Brian back into my life in any capacity, for allowing his emergency to become my crisis when I'd spent 6 years building a life that didn't include him. I'd worked so hard to move on, and here I was, trapped in his drama again, losing sleep over his problems. Fleur leaned forward and said something that stuck with me. That anger was information. It was telling me my boundaries had been violated the moment I agreed to meet Brian at that diner. Not by him asking, which was desperate but understandable, but by me entertaining the request as if I owed him consideration. She reminded me that I didn't owe Brian or Stephanie anything. Not my time, not my energy, and definitely not my organs. The fact that I was even weighing this decision showed how much his manipulation still affected me after all these years. Robert and I stayed up late that Friday night talking about our future and whether this decision affected it. We were sitting on our back porch watching the ocean, and he admitted he was worried about me going through major surgery. The risks scared him. The recovery time scared him. But he said he was more worried about me making a choice I'd regret either way. If I donated and something went wrong, would I resent Stephanie and Brian for the rest of my life? If I refused and she died, would I be able to live with that choice? He wasn't trying to influence me either direction. He was just being honest about his fears, which I appreciated more than any advice could have helped. I told him I didn't know yet what I'd regret more. That's what made this so hard. There was no clear right answer, just 2 different paths with 2 different sets of consequences I'd have to carry forever. Saturday morning, I drove to my elementary school, even though it was the weekend. The building was empty and quiet. I used my key to let myself into my classroom and sat at my desk surrounded by my students' artwork on the walls and their small chairs arranged in reading circles. I thought about the kids I taught, their trust in me, the way they looked up to teachers as examples of how to be in the world. What lesson was I teaching through this choice? That forgiveness requires self-sacrifice? That you should give pieces of yourself to people who hurt you because it's the kind thing to do? Or was I teaching that boundaries matter even when situations are desperate? That you can feel sympathy for someone's suffering without making it your responsibility to fix? I sat there for over an hour trying to figure out which lesson I actually believed in. The classroom felt different empty like this, more like a stage than a real place. I realized I was performing even in my own head, trying to figure out which choice made me look better instead of which choice felt right. Sunday afternoon, Mariana came over with coffee and her laptop. She said we needed to make a list of pros and cons that went beyond the obvious stuff. We sat at my kitchen table and started writing. Not just simple things like surgery risks versus saving a life. We included questions about the future. How would I feel about this choice in 5 years? What did this teach my future self about my worth and my boundaries? What precedent did this set for how people could treat me and still expect my help? We wrote down concerns about Robert having to take care of me during recovery, when this wasn't his problem to deal with. We wrote down thoughts about whether I could handle seeing Brian at follow-up appointments, or if Stephanie had complications. We even wrote about the baby, and whether I'd wonder about that child growing up, whether they'd someday find out their mother's life was saved by the woman their father cheated on. The list grew to 2 full pages, and nothing on it made the decision any clearer. But somehow seeing it all written out made me feel less crazy for struggling with this. Mariana didn't try to tell me what to do. She just helped me see all the angles I'd been too emotional to consider clearly before. When she left that evening, I folded the list and put it in my nightstand drawer. I wasn't ready to decide yet, but I was getting closer to knowing what I actually wanted, separate from what anyone else thought I should want. The week passed slowly, each day feeling longer than the last while I waited to reach the point where I was ready to tell Brian my answer. Monday morning, my phone rang at 7 a.m. and Brian's name lit up the screen, but I let it go to voicemail while I got ready for work. He called again during lunch, then twice more that afternoon, and I ignored every single one because I needed just one more day to sit with my decision before everything changed. That evening, I called Fleur and asked if she could fit me in for one final session before I talked to Brian, and she cleared her schedule for the next morning. We met at her office at 8 a.m. and she had me sit in the chair across from her empty one. She asked me to pretend she was Brian and tell her my decision. Then we'd switch and I'd play Brian responding to myself. The role play felt silly at first, practicing saying no to an empty chair. But then Fleur started responding as Brian would, and suddenly it wasn't silly anymore. She begged and cried and called me selfish. Through every guilt trip and manipulation Brian had used before, and I practiced staying calm and firm through all of it. She grabbed my wrist during one round, and I practiced pulling away and stating my boundary clearly. By the end of the session, I felt ready. My decision solid in my chest like something I could hold on to when Brian tried to shake it loose. That night, I made Robert's favorite dinner and waited until we'd finished eating before I told him I decided not to donate my kidney. He set down his fork and came around the table to where I was sitting, pulling me up into a hug that lasted several minutes. I explained my whole reasoning while he held me, how this wasn't about punishing anyone, but about recognizing I didn't owe my body to people who hurt me, how other donors existed even if they took longer to find, how I needed to protect myself first. Robert pulled back to look at my face and said he was proud of me for choosing what was right for me instead of what was easiest, or what made me look best to other people. We stayed up late talking about what would happen next, how Brian would react, whether this would really be the end of his involvement in my life. The next morning, I called Brian before I could second-guess myself and told him to meet me at the same diner where this whole thing started. He agreed immediately, his voice jumping with hope that made my stomach hurt because I knew I was about to crush it. I got there first and took the same booth we'd sat in before, ordering coffee I didn't drink while I waited. Brian walked in 10 minutes later looking desperate and hopeful at the same time, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to read my answer before I said it. He slid into the booth across from me and started to reach for my hands, but I pulled them into my lap. I didn't waste time with small talk or explanations about my process. I told him directly that I wasn't donating my kidney to Stephanie, and I watched his face go completely blank, like his brain couldn't process what I'd just said. I explained this wasn't about being vindictive or punishing anyone for the past, but about recognizing that I don't owe my body to anyone regardless of circumstances, and that other options exist, even if they're slower or less convenient than using me. The blankness on Brian's face shifted into shock, then anger, then suddenly he was crying, actual tears running down his cheeks while he called me a murderer. He said I was killing his wife and child, that I'd have to live with their deaths on my conscience forever, that he'd never forgive me and neither would anyone else who knew what I'd done. I stayed calm even though my hands were shaking under the table. I told him that Stephanie's medical condition wasn't my fault or my responsibility, that 3 other potential donors were being evaluated according to what the coordinator told me, and that his attempt to manipulate me with guilt just proved I'd made the right choice. I stood up to leave and Brian's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist exactly like he'd done during our first meeting, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. The waiter who'd served us that first time appeared immediately at our table asking if I needed help, and I said yes without hesitation. He told Brian he needed to leave right now or he'd call the police, and Brian finally let go of my wrist and stumbled out of the diner while other customers stared. I sat back down in the booth shaking but feeling strangely powerful for enforcing my boundary with witnesses, for not backing down when Brian tried to physically intimidate me into changing my answer. Robert picked me up 15 minutes later, and we drove to the beach near our house without talking much. We walked along the water holding hands while the wind blew my hair around, and the waves crashed loud enough to drown out my thoughts. I felt lighter than I had in weeks, like I'd finally put down something heavy I'd been carrying since Brian first called, and Robert squeezed my hand like he understood without me having to explain it. 2 days later, Gavin Crawford called my cell phone with his lawyer voice on, threatening legal action and claiming I'd made verbal commitments during the medical testing that created an obligation. I told him I was recording the call and hung up, then immediately told Robert, who laughed and said his lawyer would find this hilarious. Robert's lawyer called me back an hour later, still chuckling, and confirmed I had zero legal obligation whatsoever, that organ donation is completely voluntary under all circumstances, and that any continued harassment could result in a restraining order against both Brian and his attorney. I showed up at the school the next morning feeling lighter than I had in weeks, and my principal, Mrs. Henderson, caught me smiling at my desk during planning period. She knocked on my doorframe and asked if she could come in, her face soft with concern. I told her I'd made my decision about the kidney and wasn't going through with the donation. She crossed the room and hugged me right there in my classroom, something she'd never done before. She said she was glad, that I deserved to protect myself, that the school would support whatever time I needed to process everything. Her words made my throat tight because I hadn't realized how much I needed someone in authority to tell me I'd made the right choice. She added that she'd been worried about me taking on major surgery during the school year, that my students needed me healthy and present. I thanked her and she squeezed my shoulder before leaving, and I sat there feeling validated in a way Brian's anger couldn't touch. Mariana texted me during lunch asking if I was free after work, saying she wanted to take me out. We met at a wine bar downtown, the kind with exposed brick and too many candle options. She ordered a bottle of Prosecco before I even sat down and raised her glass the moment it arrived. She said she was relieved I chose myself for once, her voice firm with conviction. She reminded me how I'd spent years accommodating Brian's needs and ignoring my own, how I'd scheduled my life around his pharmaceutical conferences and client dinners. She said this decision proved how much I'd grown since the divorce, that the old me would have said yes just to avoid being called selfish. I sipped my wine and realized she was right. 6 years ago, I would have donated the kidney just to prove I was a good person, to show Brian I was better than him. Now I understood that being good didn't require mutilating myself for people who'd already taken so much. My phone buzzed while Mariana was talking about her own divorce. A Facebook message notification from an account I didn't recognize. I opened it and saw my cousin's profile picture. A new account she'd created just to reach me. Her message called me evil, said I was condemning an innocent woman and baby to death, that karma would come for me. I read it twice and felt nothing. No guilt or shame or anger. Her words landed differently this time, like they were bouncing off something solid instead of sinking in. I showed Mariana the message and she rolled her eyes, called my cousin a hypocrite who only showed up to judge. I blocked the new account and realized I didn't need approval from people who'd only appeared in my life to criticize my choices. My cousin had picked Brian's side 6 years ago when she went to his wedding. Her opinion now meant nothing. 2 weeks passed in a blur of normal life. Teaching fractions, grading spelling tests, running on the beach with Robert. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes expecting Brian to call. Then Benjamin Rogers' number appeared on my screen one Tuesday afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice sounded warm when he spoke. Nothing like the desperate father I'd met at the coffee shop. He said they'd found a match through the National Registry, someone who was moving forward with the donation. His words came out relieved and grateful. He thanked me for considering it, said he understood my choice completely, that he wished me well. I told him I was glad Stephanie would get the help she needed and meant it. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the school parking lot feeling something lift off my chest that I hadn't known was still there. The news about another donor changed everything in my head. I'd been carrying this weight of maybe being Stephanie's only chance, of potentially letting someone die. Now that burden belonged to someone else who'd volunteered without the baggage I carried. I felt genuinely glad she'd get the transplant, that the baby would be okay. No regret touched me about refusing to be the donor myself. I could hope for Stephanie's recovery while still maintaining my boundaries with people who'd hurt me. Those two things weren't contradictory like Brian had tried to make them seem. Fleur's office felt different during my next appointment, less heavy than the sessions where I'd been processing the decision. We talked about why I felt relieved instead of guilty, now that another donor had been found. She helped me understand that compassion doesn't require self-harm, that I could care about someone's medical crisis without sacrificing my own body to fix it. She said boundaries weren't walls meant to punish people, but fences meant to protect yourself. I told her about my cousin's message and how it hadn't landed the same way, how the words just slid off instead of sticking. Fleur smiled and said that was growth, that I'd built something strong enough inside myself that other people's judgment couldn't penetrate anymore. We spent the rest of the session talking about how to maintain that strength, how to keep choosing myself even when people called it selfish. Robert surprised me that Friday by saying he'd booked us a weekend at a bed and breakfast in wine country. He'd packed my bag while I was at work, thrown in my hiking boots and the sundress he liked. We drove north with the windows down, his hand on my knee while music played. The bed and breakfast sat on a hillside covered in grapevines, the kind of place that served fancy cheese plates and had clawfoot tubs. We spent Saturday hiking through vineyards, tasting wine at small family operations, eating bread and olives in the sun. Robert didn't mention Brian or Stephanie once, just held my hand and pointed out hawks circling overhead. Sunday morning, we had breakfast on a patio overlooking the valley, and I remembered why I'd married someone who treated me like an equal partner. He asked what I was thinking, and I told him I was happy. Genuinely happy. Maybe for the first time since Brian's phone call had disrupted everything. Robert kissed my temple and said good, that I deserved to be happy without qualification or guilt. Monday morning, I walked into my classroom feeling more present than I had in weeks. My students noticed immediately, asking why I seemed different, if something good had happened. I told them I'd had a nice weekend and started our lesson on personal boundaries and saying no. We talked about how it's okay to refuse requests that make you uncomfortable, how your body belongs to you and nobody else gets to decide what happens to it. One of my students asked what to do when someone gets mad at you for saying no. I told her that's their problem, not yours, that you can't control other people's reactions, only your own choices. While I was teaching, I realized I was giving them something I'd finally learned myself, that boundaries weren't mean or selfish, but necessary for survival. 3 months passed before Mariana showed me the Facebook post. We were having coffee in the teacher's lounge when she pulled out her phone, her face careful. A mutual friend had posted about Stephanie's successful transplant surgery, photos of her looking healthy and awake, holding her growing belly. The baby was healthy according to the caption. Everything had gone perfectly with the registry donor. Mariana watched my face while I read, probably checking for regret or anger. I felt neither, just genuine happiness that Stephanie had survived, and the baby would be okay. I was completely at peace with my choice not to be involved. My decision had been about protecting myself, not punishing anyone, and seeing Stephanie alive didn't change that. Robert found me looking at flights to Rome later that week. He came up behind my chair and wrapped his arms around me, his chin on my shoulder. I told him I wanted to finally take that anniversary trip to Italy, the one I'd been planning when Brian left. He said we should do it, that we should book the nicest hotels and eat at every restaurant I'd researched 6 years ago. We spent the evening planning our route through Rome, Florence, the Amalfi Coast, all the places I'd dreamed about visiting. Booking those flights felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me and making it better with someone who actually valued me. Robert asked if I wanted to go to the same church in Rome I'd planned to visit with Brian, and I said no, that we'd make our own itinerary, our own memories. This trip would be ours, not a recreation of something that never happened. He kissed me and said that sounded perfect. That night, I fell asleep easily and didn't wake up once until my alarm went off the next morning. No nightmares about surgery rooms or Brian's desperate face or losing pieces of myself. Just solid, peaceful sleep, like my body finally understood what my mind had decided weeks ago. I woke up feeling rested for the first time since Brian's phone call had turned everything upside down. Robert was already awake, watching me with this soft smile, and he said I looked different, lighter somehow. I realized my shoulders weren't tight anymore. That constant knot in my stomach had disappeared, and I could take deep breaths without feeling like something was pressing on my chest. My body believed me now that I was safe, that I'd made the right choice, that I didn't owe anyone pieces of myself no matter how desperate they were or how guilty they tried to make me feel. 6 months later, I stood at the starting line of my first full marathon with hundreds of other runners, my heart pounding, but in a good way this time. I'd trained all spring and summer, building up my miles every week, pushing my body to see what it could do when I treated it with respect, instead of thinking about cutting it open and giving parts away. The race was brutal, way harder than any half marathon I'd run before, and around mile 20, my legs started screaming at me to stop. But I kept going because crossing that finish line with my body intact and strong would prove something important, something I needed to prove to myself more than anyone else. When I finally saw the finish line ahead, I started crying and couldn't stop, stumbling across it with tears streaming down my face while strangers cheered. Robert was right there waiting like he'd promised, holding a huge bunch of sunflowers because he knew roses reminded me of my wedding to Brian. He wrapped me in a hug even though I was disgusting and sweaty, and he whispered that he was proud of me, that watching me run 26 miles was incredible. Standing there with my finisher medal around my neck, my body tired but whole and mine, I knew without any doubt that I'd chosen correctly. A year after refusing the donation, I stood in front of a new group of third graders on the first day of school, learning their names and starting to figure out their personalities. During our afternoon lesson about treating each other with kindness, I also taught them about boundaries, about how you can care that someone has a problem without making that problem your own to solve. I told them it's okay to say no when someone asks for something that makes you uncomfortable or scared, that your body belongs to you and nobody else gets to decide what happens to it. One little girl with braids raised her hand and asked what to do when saying no makes people mad at you, and I told her that's their problem to deal with, not yours, that you can't control how other people react to your boundaries. While I was teaching, I realized I actually believed these words now in a way I never could have before Brian showed up asking for my kidney. I'd learned the lesson I was teaching them, really learned it deep down where it counted. That evening, Robert and I walked down to our beach like we did most nights when the weather was nice, carrying a blanket and a bottle of wine to watch the sunset. We sat close together with his arm around me while the sky turned orange and pink and purple, and out of nowhere he said he admired how I'd handled everything with Brian. I turned to look at him, surprised, and he explained that watching me stand up for myself, even when everyone was pressuring me to give in, had shown him how strong I really was. I realized sitting there on our beach that I admired myself too, not because I'd been cruel or vindictive to Brian and Stephanie, but because I'd finally understood that protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. I'd chosen my own well-being over someone else's emergency, and that choice had led me here to this moment, genuinely happy with the life we'd built together in our little house by the water. The sunset painted everything gold, and I leaned into Robert's warmth, feeling completely at peace with every decision that had brought me to this exact spot.